Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. This is the podcast that asks, what is Britishness? If you've been following me on Instagram at Fleming Never Dies, you'll know that I've spent a bit of time recently in Kuwait, and people have asked me, business or pleasure? And the answer, quite honestly, is both. I've been doing some work out there, as well as some touristing, as well as going along to a tailor and having a dishwasher run up. Good fun. And popped out to the desert for a little bit. Anyway, I very much enjoyed it, and what better place for me to do lots and lots of research on Gertrude Bell. I feel there's a limited amount about her out there, which made it all the more attainable for me to try and get through all of it somehow. Gertrude Bell, who I think is kind of a forgotten imperialist. First of all, I thought I'd have a look at the Encyclopedia Britannica, because that tends to be very, very factual and to the point. So for those unfamiliar with her, this is our thumbnail sketch of who she is. Gertrude Bell, in full, Gertrude Margaret Lothian Bell, born July 14th, 1868 in Washington Hall, Durham, in England, died July the 12th, 1926, Baghdad, Iraq, English traveller, administrator in Arabia, and writer who played a principal part in the establishment in Baghdad of the Hashemite dynasty. Gertrude Bell's brilliant career at Oxford, where she took a first in history in 1887, was followed by some time spent in Tehran, where her uncle Sir Frank Lascelles was British minister. Returning to the political and intellectual salons in England and Europe for a decade, she did not until 1899 embark on the career of Arabian activities that made her famous. She visited Palestine and Syria, and in that year and was often back in the Middle East, during the next decade extending her travels to Asia Minor, Thomas's note, nowadays known as just Turkey. But her heart was set on an Arabian journey, which she began in 1913, being the second woman, after Lady Anne Blunt, to visit Hyle, where she was not favourably received, although she ever after favoured the Ibn Rashid dynasty in its struggle against the Ibn Saud dynasty. She never wrote a full account of this journey, though her literary output during the 20 years preceding World War I had been considerable, including Safarnameh in 1894, poems from the Divan of Hafiz in 1897, The Desert and the Sown in 1907, which has been printed again and again, that's my own note, The 1001 Churches in 1909, and From Amurath to Amurath in 1911. Her vast correspondence was published in an edited form in 2 volumes by her stepmother in 1927. Again, continuing with the Encyclopedia Britannica, perhaps her greatest work was a masterly official report on the administration of Mesopotamia during the difficult period between the armistice of 1918 and the Iraq Rebellion of 1920. For anyone unfamiliar, Mesopotamia is pretty much the old name for what we now think of as Iraq. It was, of course, an Ottoman province before the First World War. After a short period of war work in England and France, she plunged into the rough and tumble of Middle East politics, mainly in Mesopotamia, popularly known to British soldiers as Mespot, by the way, where she served in turn under Sir Percy Cox and Sir Arnold Wilson. She helped place the Hashemite ruler Faisal I on the throne of Iraq in 1921. The last 3 years of her life were devoted to the creation of an archeological museum in Baghdad. She insisted for the first time that antiquities excavated should stay in the country of their origin, thereby ensuring the National Museum of Iraq, which is her monument in the land she loved, would possess a splendid collection of Iraq's own antiquities. Facing ill health and profound loneliness, Bell took a fatal dose of sleeping pills and died July the 12th, 1926 in Baghdad. As I say, the Encyclopedia Britannica is short and to the point, and quite factual, although that last fact, did she take the fatal dose, is actually very much debated, and was it even deliberate? She was very much, the founder of what we now think of as Iraq. She helped draw those boundaries. She very much put that dynasty into power that ruled the country for decades in its initial independence, and she made a fair few enemies, so that has been questioned quite a lot. But I thought I'd start out at the Encyclopaedia Britannica just to get some raw facts. But then I thought I'd go to the other end of the spectrum and have a look at The Guardian's comment upon her. The Guardian, from my perspective, seems to be quite critical of anyone connected with the British Empire, but also, it tends to have sympathy for feminist views, and here is a great woman succeeding in what many would describe as a man's world. Are they sympathetic towards her as a great woman, or are they critical of her as a great imperialist? They wrote an article on her in 2020, Victorian Bluestocking, who helped found Iraq. They say it might seem a stretch to call Gertrude Bell lesser known, given that Werner Herzog made a biopic about her, Queen of the Desert, starring Nicole Kidman. However, the movie was a critical and commercial flop, and Gertrude is still far from being a household name. Her achievements were extraordinarily wide-ranging. She was a precocious and gifted scholar, travelled around the world twice, spoke better Arabic than T.E. Lawrence, translated Persian poetry, and carried out archaeological work in Turkey and Mesopotamia. Her greatest and most troubled legacy is Iraq itself. As the modern Middle East took shape from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, Gertrude argued in favour of Iraqi self-government, helping establish its borders, drafted its constitution, and founded its national museum. Okay, fairly fair to say that they too are impressed by her extraordinary achievements, and they can't help but mention T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. She was an archaeologist first and foremost, a bit like he went out to look at some of the forts on the Levant. She went deep into Arabia and Persia and saw the site of the Gates of Babylon. Now, I've seen the Gates of Babylon, a museum in Berlin when I was a child, and it very much stays in my mind. So when she first went out there, she was working very closely with German archaeologists, so I find it interesting. She argued that things should stay in the country, perhaps to give them an idea of, unified history, something they can all share in, as the empire's dividing up, and there are big questions where it should be divided and how. Some people describe the borders as quite artificial, but I find they do match on pretty well to the Ottoman divisions, which have been there for around 500-600 years. But this idea about the monuments remaining there might not just be about rallying people round a shared history, but might also be the impression the Germans made upon her as they took monuments home, and she saw the loss. As I say, the Gates of Babylon are hugely impressive where they are now, but it would be interesting to see them in situ. Of course, the reason you have that connection is because the Germans and the Turks had a very strong alliance. I mean, they were allies in the First World War, but they had been building up an alliance long before that, because of course the Turks were looking at the British and the French, who were considering dividing up the empire, both of which were frightened of Russia, and the Turks really saw the Germans as the friendliest party. And as you potter around, say, Istanbul today, you see the German fountain by the Blue Mosque. You can see one of the gorgeous old German train station. Most buyers don't go into the German-Ottoman connection very much, so I thought it might be interesting to flag it here. So that's how she first got in, because, as a British, I hesitate to use the word aristocrat, she was the daughter of millionaires. They were not aristocratic though, they were relatively new money, but she was able to get into the circle, say, in European society, and that helped her travel along to these places. It gave her access, that German-Ottoman connection. Anyway, she saw many of those archaeological sites. I've worked in Saudi Arabia. I spent 6 months there teaching English to the most conservative Islamic clerics in Saudi Arabia. They were the men who trained the religious police. But I was able to get out and see some of the archaeological sites way out in the desert. So many people are familiar with Petra, even if just through Indiana Jones, the treasury at Petra is at the end of the Last Crusade. The same civilization which built that built Madain Saleh, which is considered a cursed city, or was considered a cursed city in Saudi. But certainly going there, because it was considered cursed, it was completely abandoned. So seeing these extraordinary tombs out in the desert was a very striking experience. So I found it very interesting. She went out there to see these archaeological sites, and there is on YouTube a lecture on purely her archaeological work, because a lot of people look at how she helped found Iraq, but her archaeology in itself was also interesting. As I say, I found it really interesting to go through all the different material that I could find, but most of them, at their basis, at their root, went to the work of Georgina Howell, who is her biographer. She wrote, well, a few books. Queen of the Desert seems to be the most prominent. Queen of the Desert, The Extraordinary Life of Gertrude Bell, which was the basis for the Werner Herzog movie. It was the basis for the BBC Great Lives podcast on her. It was the basis for a BBC audio drama. And in fact, most articles I read will ultimately cite this one book as their source. So the blurb states simply, archaeologist, spy, Arabist, linguist, author, poet, photographer, mountaineer and nation builder, Gertrude Bell was born in 1868 into a world of privilege and plenty, but she turned her back on all that for her passion for the Arab peoples, becoming the architect of the independent Kingdom of Iraq and seeing its first King Faisal safely onto the throne in 1921. Queen of the Desert is her story, vividly told and impeccably researched, drawing on Gertrude's own writings, both published and unpublished. Previously published as Daughter of the Desert, this is a compelling portrait of a woman who transcended the restrictions of her class and age, and in doing so created a remarkable and enduring legacy. Just to pick up on a few things, so yes, she was an Arabist and was able to learn many different Arab dialects, apparently better than Lawrence of Arabia. She was also supposedly a spy, yes, a mountaineer, and that was something she did from a relatively young age, and a photographer, and a very, very skilled photographer. She photographed all the ancient monuments and archaeological sites that she saw. Since the region has been in tumult more recently, it's actually a vital resource today to see her photographs, to see how it was able to weather, well, thousands of years worth of weather until very recent conflicts have damaged some of those sites. So those photographs are important, I say, archaeologically, but they're also just very, very beautiful. She had quite an eye for the camera. Anyway, it says that she was born into a wealth of privilege. Her grandfather was one of those pioneering industrialists of the north, so their family was kind of looked down upon by the aristocrats as mere millionaires. They were just trade, fundamentally. But her grandfather employed around 40,000 men in the northeast of England. Huge numbers of families totally dependent on the Bell family, and she grew up in Redcar. So when I was reading the biography Queen of the Desert, I did find it referred sometimes to her Yorkshire upbringing, but some of it's up in Cumbria, and the BBC, when they covered it, it was very much I think Newcastle, where they were focused on that. But the family owned 3 grand houses in the region, so they're very much a family of the north. And she does really form part of the tradition of, I say, she's not an aristocrat, but that tradition of aristocratic women engaged in adventure and power. So when in the 70s you get feminist historians really trying to look at history from a woman's perspective, you do get some kind of difficult women who are really not included, because they're not fighting on behalf of women, they're fighting on behalf of themselves, their kingdom. You know, Eleanor of Aquitaine is not favoured by many feminists, neither is Boadicea or Margaret Thatcher. I mean, there's just some women who don't really fit the feminist narrative, and Gertrude Bell kind of is one of those who doesn't quite fit. She is a non-pareil, she is an outlier, she is something really quite different. But again, she's not as well known, I'd say, as Lawrence of Arabia. I think about 1/3 or 2/3 of people on Instagram had seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and I was surprised actually at how many had seen it, whereas I didn't know that this 2015 film, Queen of the Desert, even existed. I did try to watch it. It was fairly late when I tried to watch it. I couldn't get into it. It is widely regarded as quite bland. You do have Nicole Kidman as the star, Robert Pattinson as T.E. Lawrence. I think it was the Guardian review said he looks a little self-conscious in the headdress, although perhaps no more self-conscious that Lawrence himself looked in it. The Amazon review of the DVD says Gertrude Bell deserved better. Rotten Tomatoes, which I know is favoured by some, 18% by the critics, 35% by the audience. So again, not a well thought of film. I looked into some of the reviews. One person said it was a well-made invitation to nod off. Again, I was watching it late and tired, but I just had to switch it off and go to sleep. Another said, Bell was an extraordinary figure, tailor-made for a dazzling presence like Kidman, but Werner Herzog, directing his own script, unwisely structured Bell's story around her intimate relationships with men. Well, indeed, I mean, it's, well, we're about halfway through this podcast, and I haven't even thought to mention anything about her romantic life, because, to be honest, it's just not the most interesting thing about her. And of course, Lawrence of Arabia doesn't really dwell on the romantic side of his life. Not that much is known about his. For Gertrude Bell, a lot is known about her relationships with men because her letters were preserved. Her letters are beautifully written, held by the University of Newcastle, and I feel you get so much. I wonder which you'd get more from: downloaded WhatsApp messages or saved letters. I feel with letters, people who can express themselves so well and so beautifully as she could, you might get a little bit more than a quick WhatsApp message. Anyway, IMDb, about as bland as lifeless as you can get. Another reviewer, Herzog directs romantic tosh instead of strong woman epic this film demanded. Gertrude Bell, best looked up on Google to discover her achievements. And perhaps that focus on achievement is why it doesn't make for a great film. For a film you want, the tortured drama of Lawrence of Arabia, constantly questioning what is going on and who is he, and having that kind of crisis of identity, whereas Gertrude Bell seemed fully confident in who she was. Thank you very much. Anyway, the book, as I say, the film is based on the book. Other podcasts have been based on this book, so I did read it, or I've been reading it now, and I haven't finished it yet. I'm reading it, and honestly I have felt it compelling, and I also very much appreciate the very, very, very generous free sample on Kindle. I've been thoroughly enjoying it. So just in that first sample you have a family background, her grandfather, the all-domineering industrialist. You have her father, who is also a highly driven individual. You have her mother's death at a very young age, and her French stepmother coming in, and what an interesting person she was. You have Gertrude Bell's difficult teenage years, as she was a very forthright character and just got bored, immensely bored, being home educated initially. Then she was sent to a girls' college where she had to kind of hide her wealth, being mere millionaires, and ultimately rising through academia to Oxford. I love, again, that the Amazon review of this book, I quite like. Someone wrote, "An admirable and fascinating woman, but not one I'd like to have coffee with." I kind of agree with that. If I had a choice, I'd probably have coffee with her stepmother, the French stepmother who came in, really because her father initially had no intention to remarry, and said to her sister, "You come up and live with me," and I think it was her sister who was absolutely not interested in being a spinster aunt, kind of pushed and arranged, and it was thought to be a very, very good arrangement. I like this. Anyway, after their honeymoon, the stepmother and her father came to the UK. Their honeymoon was indeed in Washington DC, which is an unusual choice of location then and even now. Then they come to London, and they need to go up north, so they go up north on the North Eastern Railway, which is now the LNER, which I use quite often going up and down. Their family owned it. So the Bells were transport royalty. So I'm going to delve into the book, Queen of the Desert. I'm going to read out a little bit, because I do find this bit so interesting. At Middlesbrough, the station master doffed his cap and ushered them onto the train to Redcar. Many years later, Florence's daughter, Lady Richmond, was to remember an occasion when she was seeing her father off from King's Cross, and he had remained on the platform so that they could talk until the train left. The packed train failed to leave on time. Remarking on its lateness, they continued to talk until they were approached by a guard. "If you would like to finish your conversation, Sir Hugh," he suggested, doffing his cap, "we will then be ready to depart." The train to and from Redcar had a personal Bell stopping place on a tiny platform inside the Red Barn's garden. Hugh, returning from the works, could simply step out of the train and cross the rose garden by the fountain and reach his own back door. Gertrude, who was always waiting there, would greet him joyfully. Absolutely love that. Anyway, the couple have their honeymoon. On the couple's return from their honeymoon, both children would have been washed and brushed and be waiting on the Bell platform to greet them. The staff would have been lined up behind them, ready to curtsy or bow. Florence, hoping to make a firm bond with them from the start, had intended, as soon as she arrived, to ask Gertrude and Maurice to show her into every corner of the house, from cellar to attic, Maurice being the younger brother. However, to her dismay, they had been joined at Middlesbrough by Hugh's brother Charles, who, with the kindest of intentions but no sensitivity at all, accompanied them to Red Barns. Hugh, equally unromantic, went straight to his office on the ground floor and started to go through his papers. Abandoned with Charles in the drawing-room and passionately wanting him to go, Florence made distracted conversation with her new brother-in-law, who sat solidly in an armchair, also stuck for something to say. The contented Ada departed, that's the sister, departed for London, and a new life began for 8-year-old Gertrude and 5-year-old Maurice. Since children of that age do not naturally assume that their parents have a life independent of their own, they must have been shocked to hear that their father had married Florence. Talking about their new stepmother later, it was Maurice's guess that she was 80, but his sister thought she might be a bit younger. Perhaps, she suggested, Florence was 60. Poor Florence was actually 24, 8 years younger than Hugh, and so came into Gertrude's life the good-hearted woman who would influence and form her more than any other, sometimes in opposition, but chiefly in fundamental and positive ways. Florence had many talents. She had a keen appreciation of music and literature. She wrote books, essays and plays. She was able to get on with all kinds of people. She was deeply interested in sociology and the education of her children. Everything she did remained within the limits of the role she considered the most important for a woman, those of wife and mother. She gave herself unstintedly to her family while achieving a body of work in the community that would earn her public recognition and eventually make her a dame of the British Empire. The drawing-room dramas and comedies she liked to write were initially for the children to perform at Christmas and other family gatherings. In time, through the intervention of theatrical friends, she would have 3 plays put on in the West End. Characteristically, she chose to remain anonymous. Florence was nonplussed, at first, by northern manners. As soon as she met her neighbours, she began to institute an at-home on Tuesdays, when she hoped couples would drop in for light refreshments, non-alcoholic. She was mystified to discover that Yorkshiremen did not accompany their wives on this sort of occasion. Her biographer, Kirsten Wong, writes that when one lady turned up at the Bells with her husband, she disconcerted Florence by whispering, "I managed to bring Mr. T with me. I had such work to make him come." Apparently believing there was safety in numbers, the women would arrive together, then seat themselves as far apart as possible, after which a silence would fall. A desperate Florence, offering them chairs closer to the fire, would meet with a response, "Thank you, I am very well where I am." In one of her books, Florence writes of her heroine, a teacher who had newly come to the north. The girl was ill at ease with the downright Yorkshire women who surrounded her. In that class of life, when people have nothing to say, they say nothing. Their rough, blunt manner, when they did speak, alarmed her still more. Nevertheless, the women after their fashion were not unkind to her. The new Mrs. Bell persevered, and before long her entertainments were obligatory events in the life of the town. But Florence was far more interested in cementing her relationship with Hugh's children. The 8-year-old observed her in speculative fashion. This stranger, who had burst into their family life, had something about her that the child would not have recognised, a Parisian polish in both her manners and her dress. Although Florence was essentially serious and inclined to the moralistic, she never criticised an individual's interest in her appearance or derided the love of clothes as frivolous. Her carefully considered opinion on this and other subjects were often obliquely expressed. She was an intensely private person, preferred to give her views in the form of stories or essays. In one, she wrote of the heroine, "Ursula had what the French call genre, the nearest English equivalent to the expression style, but that suggests being dashing and assertive. Genre is a grace inherent in the wearer and does not depend upon clothes, but upon the way they are put on. And the reason there is no word for it in English is that the thing is so rarely found that it is unnecessary to have a term on purpose." From Florence's example, Gertrude, in turn, would acquire genre, so that people meeting her for the first time would comment upon her Mayfair manners and Paris frocks. But Florence never followed fashion. She continued to wear Edwardian clothes all her life because she felt they suited her, even in the 1920s when every other woman was in a short skirt. Her granddaughter remembers being with Florence when she slipped and fell one day on a London pavement. The child was amazed to discover that under Florence's skirts was a pair of normal legs. Tending to primness, Florence wore grey silk gloves most of the time, indoors and outdoors, and even to play the piano. I have to say, I found that fascinating insight into Gertrude Bell's childhood, and as I say, that's all part of the free sample from Amazon, Queen of the Desert, The Extraordinary Life of Gertrude Bell by Georgina Howe. And this is very much the main source that most biographers seem to have, although if you do want just a quick half-hour, video documentary, it's a brilliant one. I was able to see this on YouTube. I'm not sure how this is for copyright purposes. but it's from the Young Indiana Jones historical documentary 79 on Gertrude Bell. Gertrude Bell, Iraq's uncrowned queen, a companion historical documentary featured on the Adventures of Young Indiana Jones DVD sets. Copyright Lucasfilm. Somebody did upload this 33-minute and 9-second runtime video to YouTube, and I have to say, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. So if it's not on there, if it's been taken down for copyright, I think the DVDs will be very, very, very well worth it. And indeed, there is a Gertrude Bell archive channel on YouTube, but it only has one video. And again, there's a lecture from the Oriental Society by Elisa Cooper. It's called Encounters with Ancient Splendors, and it really focuses on Gertrude Bell's real archeological work, especially 1909 to 1919. So many of them focus on her kind of later achievements with Iraq, but this one is an hour-long public lecture by Elisa Cooper, Associate Professor of Near Eastern Archaeology, University of British Columbia, and as I say, it really focuses on her purely as an archaeologist, and does kind of raise the fact that she taught the first king of Iraq all about his own culture and his own people that he didn't know. Lisa Cooper kind of questions, why would she do this? You know, what authority does she have to do this? But it really is the culmination of her great work. And I like this focus on Gertrude Bell's work rather than, say, her private life, fascinating though that is. I did a Tears for Tolkien episode a while ago, and very much focused on Tolkien's work, because I feel that's something that really is lacking generally. People focus very much on his private life, but we all spend the majority of our days working, and so to study somebody's work, I think, can give you quite an insight, especially for Tolkien, when it's, his work is his passion, and Gertrude Bell, her work is her passion, as she goes out very much as a Victorian adventurer, travelling in style, of course, with a library, a bath, a camp bath, and a library and so on, but also sleeping with a gun under her pillow and having to hire mercenaries, bodyguards and so on, about whom she did complain. Gosh, sometimes their guns do get in the way of her archaeological work and so on. And apparently sleeping in an outhouse at times so as not to endanger others, which is part of the question around her death. Drawing to an end here, so just a few highlights for me to mention. When you kind of Google images of her, it's fascinating. There's pictures of her between Winston Churchill and Lawrence. She was a distant cousin of Churchill's wife. So one of the complaints about the movie is Churchill says, "Oh, who is this woman?" in a rather dismissive tone. He knew full well who she was, and equally the chaps at the beginning of the film, which I watched, they're sitting around talking about, "You're getting your intelligence from a woman." It all seems a bit daft and a bit put on for the film. She was very, very, very well known, played a key role in the post-war conferences, drawing up the borders of modern-day Iraq, and really working out which provinces and how to balance the different tribes. And she's very, very easy to spot because, of course, she is the only woman. Anyway, upon her death, the Times newspaper describes her as the most distinguished woman of her day. So she really, really is a woman who was staggeringly famous at the time, but just not so well known today, and perhaps because she was really part of her own time, rather than Lawrence of Arabia, who seems like a bridge between our time and the world of the First World War, which can seem quite distant to us somehow. Anyway, I shall draw to a close now. I've talked about this in my YouTube video, so just quickly to say thank you very much to those who've started following me on YouTube very recently. Mark Fairburn, Justin Losander, Nadim Awan and Ken Lewis. Sometimes I get a notification and a name of this person has started following you. Often I don't, normally I don't, but recently I've had those 4. And in my YouTube video I talk about Lawrence of Arabia, Gertrude Bell, and of course my own family connection to Kuwait. But I'd also like to say a welcome to my newsletter subscribers, Christopher Birchall, John Sangster, Patrick Galuzzo and Roger Mitham. Thank you very much for subscribing. She'll have to get typing soon on another. These are just my kind of round robin letters, just to let you know what's going on in my life. And occasionally I draw some names at random, and I do send out postcards lately because I've been travelling. I've been sending out a few more than usual, so thank you Roland, Alex Lamas, Pete, Matt, David, Ismail, Jocelyn, Chris, Donny and another David. I hope you enjoyed your postcards and the podcasts, but I hope you enjoyed the postcards. And Chris, I hope you enjoyed your mug. So, as I say, I've been keeping busy recently, keeping in touch with quite a few people. And if you'd like to receive a newsletter, then, there's the link in the show notes, and there's also a link on my profile on Instagram, Fleming Never Dies. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know, what more would you like to know about Gertrude Bell? Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.